Assalamu alaikum and a very good morning to you people. So today we start with the perineum, one of the last topics that we have in the pelvis, abdomen, pelvis, the entire region. The perineum is the area below the pelvic diaphragm. This was the pelvic diaphragm made up of levator ani and procedures. We've already discussed that in detail. The area below the pelvic diaphragm. This area is the perineum, below the inferior fascia of the urogenital diaphragm. So, in a person, in a living person, what you see is that the perineum will be the area between the uppermost part of the two thighs, the medial two thighs. That is the area of the perineum. However, when the limbs are abducted, they are wide apart. The perineum is then the area which is between the mons pubis anteriorly, the insides of the thigh laterally on either side, the insides of the thigh, posterolaterally the gluteal folds, one on either side, and still posteriorly is the intergluteal cleft. I repeat once again, the person standing, legs wide apart. The perineum is the area bounded anteriorly by the mons pubis, laterally by the medial surfaces of the thigh, uppermost part of inside of the thigh. Posterolaterally, we have the gluteal folds, and still posteriorly, we have the intergluteal cleft. Now, what we have, the boundaries, the osseo-fibrous boundaries. That means bony and fibrous connective tissue. In that, anteriorly, this is the pubic symphysis. So this is the pubic symphysis. Anterolaterally, this is the ischiopubic ramus. This is anterolateral. Laterally, these two, one on either side, are the ischial tuberosities. These are the ischial tuberosities laterally. Posterolaterally, this is the sacrotuberous ligament from the sacrum to the tuberosity, ischial tuberosity. Okay, sacrotuberous ligament. This is sacrotuberous ligament, and posteriorly, the most posterior part is the lowermost part of the sacrum and the coccyx. This is the coccyx, this is the sacrum, the lowermost part of the sacrum and the coccyx. These are the osseo-fibrous boundaries of the perineum. I repeat once again, anteriormost is the pubic symphysis. Anterolaterally, one on either side, is the ischiopubic ramus. Laterally, we have the ischial tuberosities. Posterolaterally, sacrotuberous ligament. This is sacrotuberous ligament. And posteriorly, you have the coccyx and the lowermost part of the sacrum. Okay, now this is the entire urogenital area where the urogenital diaphragm is. So if this is a kind of a diamond-shaped area. If you look at it, this is kind of a diamond-shaped area. Okay. So you divide this diamond-shaped area by a transverse line. The transverse line runs between the two ischial tuberosities, posterior part of the two ischial tuberosities. A transverse line running divides this diamond-shaped area of the perineum into two triangles, an anterior triangle, which is the urogenital triangle, and a posterior triangle, which is the anal triangle. The urogenital triangle between the two ischiopubic rami, you can see it here. This urogenital triangle is actually closed. It is closed by this membrane, which is called perineal membrane. This whitish thing. These are actually the muscles. So these muscles are covered by the perineal membrane. You see it from the inferior surface. Okay. Just talked about the perineal membrane, so let's discuss the perineal membrane first. The perineal membrane. I'm so sorry. This whitish thing, of white thing, this is the perineal membrane. Okay? The perineal membrane is closes the urogenital hiatus. Now, if you remember correctly, when we did the floor of the pelvis, pelvic floor, this is the coccygeus, this is the levator ani. Between the levator, medial parts of the levator ani was this opening. This opening, this was the area where we had the urethra, and in the females the vagina. So this opening is actually closed or covered by the perineal membrane. This is the perineal membrane. The urethra and the vagina have to pierce the perineal membrane to come out. So it fills the gap. The perineal membrane is attached on either side to the ischiopubic rami. This is the ischiopubic rami. It is attached to the ischiopubic rami. And I just told you that it is perforated by the vagina in the females and the urethra in the males. This space is perforated by the vagina in the females here and the urethra in the males. In the males, it is only the urethra. To attach to the inferior surface of the perineal membrane are these structures, the external genitalia. ये perineal membrane है बेटा, the same membrane over here. They are attached to the inferior surface or the under surface of the perineal membrane. This is the perineal membrane. Okay? Inferior fascia. This is the urogenital diaphragm. This is the perineal membrane. It is pierced by this urethra, and of course the vagina and the female. The nerves and blood vessels and the ducts of the bulbourethral gland. We have already discussed the bulbourethral gland last time we did it. One thing I hope you can appreciate is that this perineal membrane, with a person standing in a standing position upright, the ischiopubic rami are almost lying horizontally, because the pubic symphysis is anteriorly and inferiorly placed, so the ischiopubic rami are placed almost horizontally. As a result, the perineal membrane attached to its medial surfaces is also horizontally placed. Now, this perineal body, this is an extremely important topic from your examination point of view, and more still from your practical point of view, especially those students who in the years to come want to either become gynecologists, or they are interested in perineal surgery, for them, this is extremely important. This is also called the central tendon of the perineum. It is present midway. This is one ischial tuberosity, this is the other ischial tuberosity. A line joining the two ischial tuberosities. The center of the line joining the two ischial tuberosities at the posterior margin of the perineal membrane. Because this is the perineal membrane. Okay? This entire thing between this is covered by perineal membrane. Okay, you can see it over here. Posterior margin of the perineal membrane, midway between the two ischial tuberosities. This point, this is the perineal body. So, if you look at it carefully, it is placed posterior to the vestibule of the vagina and anterior to the anal opening. So, the perineal body has the vestibule anterior to it, vestibule of vagina anterior to it. It has the anal canal, opening of the anal canal posterior to it. And of course, this is the perineal body over here. This is the perineal membrane. This is the perineal body. Okay? So between in the females, even in the males, females में ये है कि the connective tissue between the uterus and the rectum, recto-vaginal. ठीक है? Recto-vaginal connective tissue or recto-vaginal septum is attached to the perineal body superiorly. Here. If you remove the uterus from here, that is in the males, the posterior surface of the urinary bladder will come in contact with the rectum. So between them would be recto-vesical septum. Recto-vesical septum that will fuse with the perineal body from above. So superiorly it is recto-vesical or recto-vaginal septum, whatever you want to call it. Now the important thing about this perineal body is that this is a fibromuscular mass of muscles, smooth muscles be and skeletal muscles, both type of muscles. Okay? So you have multiple muscles running into it, getting inserted into this perineal body. These muscles are the bulbospongiosus. This is the bulbospongiosus inserting into the perineal body. You have the external anal sphincter, fibers of the external anal sphincter also. Then this is the superficial transverse perineum. This is the muscle on the inferior surface. This is what we see is the perineal, this is the perineal membrane. This is the perineal body. We are viewing this perineal membrane from the inferior surface. So I repeat once again, we have the bulbospongiosus muscle getting inserted into the perineal body, the superficial transverse perineum. Immediately on the superiors above the perineal membrane, you have a similar muscle called deep transverse perineum. So then you have the external urethral sphincter. You can't see it over here, but yes, I'll show it in the next slide. The external urethral sphincter. Then of course, all these are skeletal muscles. Then of course, you have a few fibers of smooth muscles of the rectum getting inserted into it. Also your perineal type of muscles, they are smooth muscles. So this is a mass of smooth muscles and skeletal muscles. Okay, let's come to the perineal fascia. The perineal fascia has a superficial layer and a deep layer. So one thing before I start off with the perineal fascia, please note one thing, that just like you have the two layers of the abdomen. Subcutaneous tissue has two layers of the abdomen, the fatty layer and the membranous layer. These fatty and membranous layer also continue into the perineum. Okay? Fatty layer में क्या होता है? This is obviously the pelvis of a female, the urinary bladder, the uterus and the rectum, the uterus and the vagina, and this is the rectum. Okay? So what happens in the fatty layer is that this fatty layer covers the mons pubis, and then please note this fatty layer is continuing into the perineum, and anteriorly and superiorly it becomes continuous with the fatty layer of the anterior abdominal wall. You probably remember it as campus fascia. It's easier to remember as the fatty layer. Males में क्या होता है? थोड़ा सा tricky है in the males. In the males, please follow this yellow line. This yellow line, sawtooth appearance of this yellow line. Okay? Now, in the males, you don't have this fatty layer. This fatty layer is replaced by the dartus muscle. So this yellow line, this serrated yellow line, this is the dartus muscle. If you remember correctly, dartus muscle was the muscle that was present within the subcutaneous tissue, paniculus adiposus type. Okay, so if you follow that yellow line, this dartus muscle, it covers the scrotum and then it continues into the urethra, into the penis. In both the genders, the fatty layer, this is the rectum, anal canal, anal opening. This would probably be the area where you have the ischioanal fossa. This is the ischioanal fossa on either side of the anal canal. Ischial tuberosities, anal canal. So between the ischial tuberosities and anal canal, this is the ischioanal fossa that we're going to study tomorrow. So for today, just remember one thing: it is filled with fat. A fat-filled ischioanal fossa. Ischial tuberosities are covered by obturator internus. Obturator internus is covered by obturator fascia. So that forms the lateral boundary, and medial boundary major. This is the levator ani. So the fascia covering the levator ani. And then of course still medially you have the rectum and the anal canal. So these are the boundary. Inferiorly, this is the skin. These are generally the boundary of the ischioanal fossa, lying one on either side of the anal canal. That is why we call it ischioanal. In our days, it used to be called ischiorectal. Erroneous stuff, because it is between the ischium and the anal canal. This is the right description. So posteriorly, in both the genders, this fatty layer becomes continuous with the fat of the ischioanal fossa. इस drawing में भी देख लीजिए, this is the dartus muscle, yellow on the outside. This is the dartus muscle. ये देख लीजिए, ये mark किया. Okay. Perineal fascia. Membranous layer. Abhi tak we've discussed the fatty layer. Now let's come to the membranous layer. The membranous layer. Now in this, will you please follow the blue line? Okay. So this is the perineal body and this is the perineal membrane. Okay. So posteriorly, the membranous layer is attached to the perineal membrane, posterior margin of the perineal membrane and the perineal body. Okay? Laterally, it fuses with the fascia lata of the thigh. Anterior, I'm so sorry. Anteriorly, it continues as the dartus fascia. This is the dartus fascia, not the dartus muscle. The dartus fascia is present inside the layer of dartus muscle. Let me go back over here. Please note, this is the dartus muscle and this pink is the dartus fascia. Okay, this is the membranous layer. You can follow it over here. It is the membranous layer on the inside of the dartus muscle. Dartus muscle, then it will continue as the campus fascia, fatty layer of the anterior abdominal wall. And please note, this becomes the membranous layer, the scarpa's fascia. So this pink is the dartus fascia. Okay. Females में भी यहाँ पे भी देख लीजिए, this is the fatty layer or campus layer of anterior abdominal wall. This anteriorly, it continues as the dartus fascia, covers the external genitalia, and then it continues superiorly into the membranous layer, continues as the membranous layer of the anterior abdominal wall. ये blue. Females में भी देख लीजिए. This blue is the, it continues into the anterior abdominal wall, deep to this fatty layer. Okay. Now, let's talk about the deep fascia, deep perineal fascia. The deep perineal fascia invests or covers the, this is the bulbospongiosus muscle, and this is the ischiocavernosus muscle. अभी करते हैं. It covers this bulbospongiosus muscle. It covers the ischiocavernosus muscle. It covers the superficial transverse perineum, which is attached to the inferior surface of the perineal membrane. This is the perineal membrane bit. Inferior fascia of the urogenital diaphragm. Abhi karte hain. This is the perineal membrane. We've just discussed in detail. And laterally, it is attached to the ischiopubic rami. This is the ischiopubic rami. So I repeat this fascia again. This fascia invests the ischiocavernosus, superficial transverse perineum, bulbospongiosus, this entire deep perineal fascia, and then anteriorly, it first is attached to the suspensory ligament of the penis or the clitoris, whatever you want to call it. Please follow this green line. And lining the posterior surface of the ischial tuberosity, it moves up and blends with the fascia covering the external oblique muscle, and in the midline, anterior layer of the rectus sheath. ये green line को follow कीजिए. ठीक है? G, let's come to the perineal pouches. The superficial perineal pouch is between the, this we are talking about this space. So it is between the perineal fascia, here, this entire thing, and the perineal membrane. This is the perineal membrane. Okay? So it is between the perineal fascia. Laterally, you have the ischiopubic rami. So laterally is the ischiopubic rami. Superiorly is the perineal membrane and inferiorly is the perineal fascia here. So this space is the superficial perineal pouch or superficial perineal space, whatever you want to call it. These perineal spaces are extremely important from your practical point of view and your examination point of view. Now, we are studying this space. Why is it so important? First, let's see the contents of the space and then you know the importance of space as well. The contents of the space, males में पहले कर लेते हैं. In the males, it is the root of the penis, which is attached to the undersurface. This is the perineal membrane, which is gray structure. So the root of the penis is attached to the undersurface of the perineal membrane. This is the bulb and the root of the penis. Okay? It is surrounded by two muscles, the bulbospongiosus and ischiocavernosus. They are also part of the perineal pouch. Then this is the superficial transverse perineae attached to the outer surface of the perineal membrane. Posterior margin पे लगा होता है, the outer surface or the inferior surface of the perineal membrane. And then, of course, you have nerves and blood vessels which are lying in this area. These are the deep perineal nerves, which are branches of urine. The arteries are branches of internal pudendal arteries. The nerves called pudendal nerves. Okay, inferior rectal की branches. Over here, you can see this, the bulb of the, and don't forget one thing. Okay, it also contains part of the urethra, spongy urethra or penile urethra, whatever you want to call it. This over here is the bulb of the penis. In here would be the urethra. Over here you see the opening of the urethra. Okay? So there is the bulb of the penis. You have the urethra, the spongy part of the urethra. Covering the bulb is the bulbospongiosus muscle. You have ischiocavernosus muscle. This is one crust. This is the other crust. Covering them is the ischiocavernosus muscle, one on either side. You have nerves and vessels over here. And of course, you females में देख लेते हैं contents का क्या difference है. Females में, once again, this is the perineal membrane and this is the inferior view. You see it from the inferior surface. So we have the clitoris and we have the vestibule, bulb of the vestibule. This is the crus. This is the bulb of the vestibule, and lying posterior to the bulb of the vestibule. In fact, the vestibule, this is the greater vestibular gland. These two greater vestibular glands, one on either side, is partly covered by the posterior margin of the bulb of vestibule. Covering these structures, covering the bulb of the vestibule, is the bulbospongiosus muscle. This is the bulbospongiosus in the females. One on either side, आधा काटा हुआ है. So this is the bulbospongiosus, one on either side. And this is the ischiocavernosus, okay? Covering the crus. Then you have the greater vestibular glands posteriorly. I just told you they are partly covered by the posterior edge of the bulb of the vestibule. And don't forget this muscle, superficial transverse perineum. Okay, this is also just like we saw it in the males. And of course, the same nerves and vessels that we have. deep nerves and vessels. Now let's compare the contents of the two pouches, in the two genders. थोड़ा सा फर्क है. External genitalia obviously going है, except कि यहाँ पे आप clitoris होगा तो यहाँ पे bulb of the penis होगा, whatever. The two muscles are the same, bulbous spongiosus. Over here we have the bulbous spongiosus, ischiocavernosus. Ischiocavernosus. Urethra is here, the spongy urethra over here. Okay, in the females, you have this proximal part of the urethra. The difference is over here in the females, you have the the greater vestibular glands. So in the females, you have greater vestibular glands in the superficial pouch. In the males, इसका कोई counterpart यहाँ पे नहीं है. Then the superficial transverse parietal, of course, that is the same in both the genders. Also is present the other muscle. अच्छा वो इसमें नहीं है फिलहाल. ठीक है? Nerves and blood vessels obviously are present here. Deep perineal pouch की बात कर लेते हैं. This is the deep perineal pouch. It is bounded superiorly by the inferior fascia of the pelvic diaphragm. Okay? Now, one thing to remember is this layer, the inferior fascia of the pelvic diaphragm, which forms the superior boundary of the deep perineal pouch. This is not a very distinct layer. Instinct होती है. Okay? Inferiorly, it is bounded by the perineal membrane. This is the perineal membrane. And laterally, please note, this is the obturator internus. This is the obturator internus, and this green line is the fascia covering the obturator internus. This is the levator ani. And this is the gap between the levator ani, between the free edges of the levator ani. This gap is filled by the perineal membrane. So we were talking. This gap is filled by the urogenital diaphragm. Perineal membrane, obviously, perineal membrane से gap fill हुआ है, definitely है. This is the perineal membrane. So on the lateral aspect, we have the inferior most part of the obturator fascia, which covers the lowermost part of the obturator internus muscle. Fascia covering the internus muscle, obturator internus muscle. Okay? This makes up the lateral margin, lateral border of the deep perineal pouch. So superiorly, it is in inferior fascia of the pelvic floor. Inferiorly is the perineal membrane, the inferior fascia of the urogenital diaphragm, and laterally we have the fascia covering the obturator internus. And of course, it is going to include in both the genders, it will include the anterior recess of the ischial fossa, वो इसमें extend करती है. Contents देख लेते हैं in the males. In the males, ये देख लीजिए, ये prostate है. This is the urinary bladder. This is the prostate, the prostatic urethra. Now the prostatic urethra leaves at the apex of the prostate and passes through the urogenital deep perineal pouch. The urethra that is present in the deep perineal pouch is called the intermediate urethra, or also called the membranous urethra. Membranous or intermediate urethra is that part of the urethra which is present in the deep perineal pouch. Okay? This is the narrowest part of the urethra. This is the least dilatable part. ये dilate नहीं होता. ठीक है? So, like the other day, I was talking to you. when a catheter is passed through the urethra, this is the site where a wide bore catheter can easily get stuck. इससे आगे नहीं जाता है, into the urinary bladder नहीं जाता, because it is wide bore. So it has to be the exact size of the urethra for the catheter to go in. Prostatic urethra is dilated, it is the widest part. लेकिन membranous urethra is not dilated. ठीक है? Then the contents in the males include, this is the deep transverse perineum. Now, this is the perineal membrane, and we are now viewing the perineal membrane from its superior aspect. Okay? This is the superior aspect of the perineal membrane. Please note one thing, that the perineal membrane, now you can see it clearly over here, it is attached to the medial surface, medial borders of the ischiopubic rami. The perineal membrane is attached to the medial borders of the ischiopubic rami, and it does not go as far as the pubic symphysis. There is a gap between the anterior margin of the perineal membrane and the pubic symphysis, and this gap is filled with fat, and it transmits the deep dorsal vein of the penis. That is why God has made this gap, and this deep dorsal vein of penis enters from here, passes through the deep pouch, deep perineal pouch, and it drains into the vesico-prostatic venous plexus over here. ठीक है? अच्छा, so हम contents की बात कर रहे थे. Contents में intermediate urethra, which is the narrowest. You have the deep transverse perineum. This deep transverse perineum, posterior edge of the perineal membrane on the superior aspect. Okay? And lying deep to the deep transverse perineum are the bulbourethral glands. You have to lift this deep transverse perineum to see the bulbourethral glands. In other words, the bulbourethral glands are resting directly on the perineal membrane. ये देख लीजिए, ये bulbourethral glands are ये white, they are lying on the perineal membrane. This over here would be the perineal membrane. And of course, don't forget the neurovascular structures, nerves and blood vessels. Females में क्या होता है? Females में एक तो यहाँ पे proximal part of the urethra आता है. Then you have the vagina. And then of course, now this is where the deep transverse perineum in the males was present. Females में there's a difference. The deep transverse perineum is not well developed in females. It is replaced, in fact, by a mass of smooth muscles. Position वही है, posterior border of the resting, lying on the posterior edge or posterior border of the perineal membrane. A mass of smooth muscles which is associated with the perineal body, because over here would be the perineal body. Okay? Covering that may be some fibers of the deep transverse perineum, but by and large, नहीं होता यहाँ पे. And then, of course, don't forget the dorsal veins of dorsal blood vessels of the clitoris. We would call it clitoris over here because it's a female. ये देख लीजिए यहाँ पे, इसमें over here would be the vagina, the urethra. You do not see that, and of course, this is the deep perineal pouch. Now let's do the comparison of the contents of the deep perineal pouch. in both genders. Males may we have the intermediate part of the urethra, ये females में proximal part. Intermediate part को बेटा membranous part भी कहते हैं. This is the proximal part of the urethra in females. यहाँ पे deep transverse perineum है. Females में mass of smooth muscles are associated with the perineal body lying on the posterior surface, posterior border. Males may we have the bulbourethral glands. Females may there is no such structure as the bulbourethral glands. And then of course, यहाँ पे you have males may neurovascular structure, the dorsal vein of the penis and clitoris, blood vessels, nerves, and यहाँ पे sorry, clitoris के होंगे. And then now one last thing before winding up is the urogenital diaphragm. अब इसमें बहुत controversy है. The children are very fond of telling me that the urogenital diaphragm now does not exist. I've consulted a few books and थोड़ा सा concept change definitely हुआ है, but the urogenital diaphragm does exist. It is basically, this is the urogenital diaphragm. It is a mass of muscles. Okay? It is bounded by a superior fascia of urogenital diaphragm formed by an inferior fascia, which is the perineal membrane. Between the two fascia is a mass of muscle. अब ये muscles जो हैं, एक तो deep transverse perineum है, an external urethral sphincter, and embedded within the external urethral sphincter are these two glands, one on either side, bulbourethral glands. So the basically deep perineal pouch के जो contents हैं, they make up the urogenital diaphragms. Namely, it is basically diaphragm is formed by the muscles, deep transverse perineum, external urethral sphincter. They make up the urogenital diaphragm, and these mass of muscles are covered by inferior fascia of the pelvic diaphragm and perineal membrane inferior. अब क्या है कि अब according to the older concept, this was a flat sort of layer of muscle. Okay? Three muscles covered by a group of muscles covered by the two fascia. This was a flat structure. But now, what they say is that yes, the deep transverse perineum is present, one on either side. That is a kind of a flat structure. But the external urethral sphincter, that is not exactly flat because it covers the part of the external urethral sphincter that encircles the urethra inferiorly, where it encircles the urethra, the bulbar urethra that enters the bulb of the penis, that part of the urethra, that is kind of flat. But then these fibers, they in the males, they extend as far as the bladder neck. Okay? Anteriorly, they are replaced by the prostate, but posteriorly, they do exist. So that is why now it becomes a more three-dimensional structure. So ये flat नहीं रहा. They are vertically placed, both the genders. Females में क्या है? This is the wall of the vagina, and this is the urethra. So it is encircling the urethra, and then you have a few fibers that go and get attached to the ischial ramus of the ischium. These fibers are called compressor urethrae. Okay? And then there are another set of fibers that encircle the urethra and the vagina together. ये इसको urethro-vaginal sphincter कहते हैं. Males में भी compressor urethrae है. It encircles the urethra and gets attached to the ramus of the ischium. Okay? and this is the external urethral sphincter. यहाँ पे ये urethral vaginal sphincter कहलाएगा. Comparison मैं आपको दिखा देती हूँ. This is kind of a flat जो that was present in the past when we studied it like this, something flat. Inferiorly is the perineal membrane, and superiorly over here, this obviously would be the deep perineal pouch, and this is the superior fascia of the urogenital diaphragm. Between the two, this is the deep perineal pouch, okay? And these muscles are lying in the deep perineal pouch. They make up the urogenital diaphragm. So it was a kind of a flat structure in our days, but now the deep transverse perineum is definitely a flat structure. This one, but the external urethral sphincter, since is more vertically placed, so it becomes a three-dimensional structure. You can see it here. Now, this last part, this is extremely important, Beta, very, very important from your practical point of view, especially, and of course, your examination point of view also. This diagram is taken from your book. Okay. If there is an injury, this is the urethra. Prostatic part, this is the urethra that passes through the urogenital diaphragm. So this would be the intermediate part or the membranous part, whatever you want to call it. This is the bulb of the penis, this dilated thing. So this is the bulbar part, and then comes the spongy part of the urethra or the penile part of the urethra. Now, hota kya hai? If the urethra gets ruptured over here in the bulb, which is something not uncommon, a fall, usually an injury to the groin. If that occurs and the urethra ruptures at this point, okay? So there is rupture of the spongy urethra or the bulbar urethra. In that case, urine from a break ho gaya yahan se. So urine from the urinary bladder will come out into the superficial space, superficial perineal pouch. So it will surround the scrotum, will be present in the scrotum, around the penis, and if untreated, can extend deep to the fatty layer. Okay? It will extend deep to the fatty layer. In contrast, this is the urogenital diaphragm here. Okay? And the urethra that passes through the urogenital diaphragm is called the intermediate or the membranous part of the urethra. If this urethra is torn, in that case, the urine plus blood is collected in the deep perineal pouch, and it extends around the prostate between the rectum and urinary bladder up here, and anteriorly over here. Anteriorly, it will be deep to the, it will be deep to the muscles of the anterior abdominal wall. So, यहाँ पे deeply placed है. Either it will be deep to the fatty layer. So this is the difference of the urethral rupture in the two sides. Because of injury, because of usually this type of injury where you have the when the membranous urethra is torn, usually this occurs in motor car injuries when there is fracture of the pelvis. ये तो गटर में गिर जाओ, एक टांग ऊपर रह गई, एक टांग नीचे आ गई. Injury to the groin can lead to this kind of. So this was my last slide. Now, Acha, what graph do you want me to say? Speed? So I thought I was going quite slow. Anyway, what graph do you want me to do? Anything you want me to repeat, Vijay? Anything you want me to repeat? Anything you haven't understood? Kamal ho gaya, thank you very much. I appreciate. Ji. Acha, that was for Madam Afshin, not for me. Okay. ठीक है. ठीक है, thank you. Anyway, Ji. Any questions? Anything you want me to repeat? Anything you haven't understood? We have a few minutes. Still 4 minutes to go, so if you have any questions, I can repeat it for you. Fatty layer of perineal fascia. Okay, okay. एक सेकंड ठहर जाइए. अच्छा जी. So I'll repeat it again. Fatty layer of perineal fascia. Please follow this yellow thing. This yellow. ठीक है? I told you earlier on that the fascia in the perineum is the same, is continuous with the fascia present in the anterior abdominal wall, which is a fatty layer and a membranous layer. This yellow is the fatty layer. ठीक है? Now, females may, now this is the pubic symphysis. Anterior to the pubic symphysis, we have this structure which is simply deposition of fat. This is called mons pubis. This gives prominence to the inferior part of the pelvis. So, females may, this fatty layer in the perineum, this continues as the fatty layer of the mons pubis and then the labia majora, and then superiorly it continues as the fatty layer of the inferior abdominal wall. So anteriorly and superiorly, this fatty layer continues as the campus fascia of the interior abdominal wall, which means it continues as the fatty layer of the interior abdominal wall. Males में क्या होता है? Males में there's a difference. Males में अब ये देख लीजिए, this yellow sawtooth kind of a structure here. ये brown is line is the skin. On the inside follow this yellow line. सारी ये जो sawtooth serrated सी जो है line, इसको आप follow कीजिए. This yellow sawtooth line was once the fatty layer, but then got converted into dartus muscle. Dartus muscle is simply muscle fibers within the fatty layer, within the connective tissue, paniculus adiposus, in the fat. So it is replaced, males may, it is replaced by dartus muscle. Okay, follow this sort of, and then it is continuous into the fatty layer of the interior abdominal wall. यहाँ पे भी देख लीजिए, surrounding the scrotum, this yellow is the fatty layer containing the dartus muscle. Now, this is the anal opening. Lying on one on either side of the anal canal is the ischio-anal fossa containing the fat. ये देख लीजिए. Anal canal on either side ischio-anal fossa.
एक्सक्यूज मी मैम, अस्सलाम वालेकुम मैम, लेक्चर का टाइम खत्म हो गया है, मैम
Okay,
वेट कर रही है।
fine, fine. ठीक है. So
थैंक
this
यू।
is, thank you, Vikram. Ischio-anal fossa. So the posteriorly it continues into the ischio-anal fossa. You can see. Okay, thank you very much.